Welcome to the Platinum Freight Podcast with Peter McRae, a podcast for business owners sharing the latest news and tips about customs clearance and freight forwarding. Welcome to episode 17 of the Platinum Freight Podcast with Peter McRae, Customs Broker. And today we're discussing importing to New Zealand via Sea Freight FCL or full container load. So, Peter, let's start with an overview. What is Sea Freight FCL and how does this differ from LCL, less than a container load, in terms of shipping and logistics?
So whenever a New Zealand importer purchases a large amount of goods from overseas, usually the goods will be sent from overseas to New Zealand in a whole shipping container. And the acronym FCL means that inside that container there is only one person's goods. So FCL meaning full container load. So the New Zealand importer will purchase the goods from one supplier overseas, and the only owner that owns those goods will be the one New Zealand importer. Whereas if the New Zealand importer had imported goods by Sea Freight as LCL, that means that they didn't have enough goods to fill a whole full container load just for themselves. So therefore, LCL means that they're going to share space with other people's goods, and that container will arrive into New Zealand. It would be unpacked, and then everybody then goes to the unpacked depot to pick up their LCL cargo. But with FCL, it's one container from overseas. One container will arrive for that importer in New Zealand. In New Zealand, there are 5 different sea ports where the full container could arrive at. So we have Auckland, then we have Taronga. In Christchurch, we have Lyttelton, we have Wellington, and in Dunedin, we have Port Chalmers. So the full containers will come off the vessel, then the full container will then need to be processed ahead of time through New Zealand Customs Service and the Ministry for Primary Industries. After those 2 border controls have been processed, the container will then need to go to an MPI approved transitional facility where the whole shipping container will be unpacked, inspected, and then the importer can then sell their goods, put the goods into stock, and then dispose of the goods to their end customer.
And what are the advantages of using FCL for importing goods to New Zealand, particularly for businesses with those larger shipments?
So the benefit of having a full container load is that the importer is able to fill up that whole shipping container with stock, and the cost advantage is that the importer will only pay one shipping cost to New Zealand, and they won't be charged port charges per cubic meter. They just get charged port charges for one shipping container. So if we look at the LCL scenario, port charges could be, for example, $200, $300 per cubic meter. So if a shipping container can hold 20 cubic meters and you're only going to pay, let's say, $800 to $900 in port charges, then there's already one huge advantage of shipping as a full container. But then shipping as a full container, you also have to pay more to ship that container from overseas to New Zealand. Whereas if you're shipping LCL, it's very cheap just to send a few pallets as sea freight to New Zealand. So each scenario has its advantages and disadvantages, but the main advantage is that the goods are not sharing space with other people's goods, and however the overseas supplier has packed that container will be the same way that the importer will see those goods once the container is unpacked at the approved transitional facility, or we say ATF. So there's less chance of other people's goods damaging the goods inside the container, because this container is one supplier, one owner, and no one else's goods are inside that container.
And how do freight forwarders assist in the process of organising and shipping a full container load from the overseas supplier to New Zealand?
First step is we would quote the New Zealand importer how much the whole service will be to clear this container once it arrives into New Zealand. And then if the New Zealand importer signs on as our customer, then we would then liaise with the overseas supplier and the New Zealand importer together. Then we advise the overseas supplier of all the issues that we need to address before the shipping container departs from overseas. On behalf of the importer, we have to clear this full container through one, the New Zealand Customs Service, and then two, we need to clear this container through the Ministry for Primary Industries, also known as MPI. And then we have to have certain paperwork to enable this container to flow smoothly through the border. But as a side note, it's important to address issues like, are the goods insured? And a lot of the time, whether it's on the supplier's side or on the New Zealand importer's side, somebody isn't thinking about insurance. So it is common for shipping containers to fall off the vessel. And I'm not saying that it happens every day, but these containers do fall off as they're traveling to New Zealand or traveling to other parts of the world. And so therefore it is important that the goods are insured for the voyage. But the other issue is that New Zealand has free trade agreements with various countries. So it's important to make sure that we have the free trade certificate before the goods depart from overseas, so that when we submit the import declaration to the New Zealand Customs Service, that the importer is allowed to claim duty-free status. So that will save the importer import duty, but the importer will still need to pay the 15% import GST.
And why is it crucial for importers to work with a customs broker to prepare for customs clearance before the FCL shipment arrives in New Zealand?
So there's a few issues, and I guess the first one is we always want to see the paperwork before the goods depart from overseas. We want to iron out all of the issues before the paperwork has been printed and stamped and finalized, because it's always easier to fix the paperwork at an early stage rather than 3 weeks, 4 weeks later. We want to make sure that we have this free trade certificate if we're able to rely on a free trade agreement between that country and New Zealand. We also need to address issues about the cleanliness of the full container. So we need to have the overseas supplier complete a packing declaration for MPI to make certain that the container can come off the vessel and then move to the approved transitional facility. The other issue is that if a customs broker is involved late in customs clearing the full container before it arrives into one of the 5 seaports, then the importer runs the risk of having to pay storage at the wharf. That's the first risk or first issue. And then the second risk is that the shipping company who owns the shipping container generally wants that shipping container returned to the wharf within, say, 7 days from when it first arrived at the New Zealand port. So it doesn't take long for 7 days to evaporate. We need to make certain that the container can leave the port, be taken to the approved transitional facility, the ATF, and then the empty container returned back to the wharf or the port to stop that clock ticking. So it's always important that New Zealand importers stay close to their customs broker, and it's always important that they reach out to their customs broker before the goods have even departed from overseas. And then the last issue is that if a New Zealand importer has never imported before, then we need to apply for a New Zealand Customs Service importer code, and that process could take as little as 10 minutes up to 3 days. So it's always, how do I say, it's like a stick in a wheel. It can slow things down if we don't have that importer code. And if a company that is importing to New Zealand has more than one director, so if we say, for example, a New Zealand business has 5 directors of the company, then we need to have 5 photo identifications for the directors before we can submit the application to get a New Zealand Customs Service importer code. And then it's not uncommon for some businesses to have 10 or 15 directors. So the New Zealand Customs Service won't provide or approve an importer code until there is one form of photo identification from each director of the business. So obviously this is easier if there's just one director. We would ask that director for the photo identification and submit the NZCS 224 and then receive the importer code. And then that importer code only ever needs to be applied once, and then we can then submit the customs declaration to both the New Zealand Customs Service and the Ministry for Primary Industries to then gain clearance from each department to allow the container to be collected from the wharf and then devanned at one of the ATFs.
And what are the key components of import duty, GST, and the import processing charge?
So with a full container load, the goods will be assessed against 3 fees. One fee is guaranteed, and that will be the import processing charge of $81.25. Then the goods will be assessed for import duty. If the goods are coming from a country where New Zealand does not have a free trade agreement, then the goods will pay import duty. And then the goods will be assessed for import GST. And in most cases that we see, a typical full container load, for example, coming from China, would pay 0 import duty, 15% import GST, and then the $81.25 import processing charge.
And how does accurate documentation impact the customs clearance process for FCL shipments?
So the documentation is key to having a compliant customs clearance. As customs brokers, we act as agents for the importer. This is the profession that we do every day, so we know what is required from both the NZCS and the MPI. And even though the customs declaration is processed and completed on any given day, that does not mean that the shipment cannot be audited at a later time by the NZCS. So the documentation does need to be accurate, does need to be correct. We need that free trade certificate on file, and then we then submit that information to the NZCS, and then as customs brokers, we know that the shipment is correct and compliant, and that is the whole purpose of a New Zealand importer retaining or paying us to do the work on their behalf.
Now, why is it important for importers to insure their FCL shipments, and what types of insurance coverage should they consider?
So, as I mentioned, shipping containers do fall off the vessel en route. If there is no insurance on the goods, then the importer will incur a great financial loss. So if they're spending thousands, tens of thousands of dollars on goods, and somebody has forgotten to have an insurance policy established for the goods, then the risk is very, very high to the importer. So the best case scenario is that no issue occurs on that shipment, but in the event that something does occur, there is no recourse for the New Zealand importer to ask for compensation because there is no insurance policy. So we always ask the overseas supplier to provide a copy of the stamped insurance policy. And because we ask that question at the very beginning, it certainly lets the New Zealand importer and us know whether the goods will be insured or the goods won't be insured, and then we then can advise the New Zealand importer that they'll need to go and get marine insurance before the goods depart from overseas. So it's a major topic, but it's always at the back of the mind. So we always bring it forward so that everybody understands who's responsible for purchasing or establishing the marine insurance policy so that the goods are covered for its voyage to New Zealand.
And finally, can you share some tips or best practices for importers to ensure a smooth process when importing goods to New Zealand via Sea Freight FCL, including the importance of early planning and coordination with logistics partners?
The most important recommendation is to speak to a customs broker early. So to talk to the customs broker, let them know what you're thinking of buying. The customs broker can then do a projected costing to let you know what they expect the New Zealand fees to be. Then if the importer agrees to that, then the customs broker will liaise with both the importer and the overseas supplier together to address all of the issues. And as customs brokers, we know what the issues are. Importers would know most of the issues, but there are issues that we bring to the table which are always at the front of mind of what we do every day. Every day it's a common sentence or a common topic that I hear where importers will say, my supplier said this, my supplier said that. And with no disrespect to overseas suppliers, they're not based in New Zealand. And this is what we do every day. And we know what we need to do to be able to have this full container processed through one of the 5 seaports with the New Zealand Customs Service and the Ministry for Primary Industries. We know what the issues are for the New Zealand importer. We know about the compliance issues. We are aware of the storage issues at the wharf. We know about the detention or the rent charges that can be charged on that shipping container. And so I recommend that New Zealand importers don't always rely on the sentence or the comment, "We ship to New Zealand all the time," because in my mind, it seems to be a bit of a proverb, and the only person that a New Zealand importer really should seek advice from is a New Zealand customs broker.
Thanks for sharing your insights and tips, Peter. Now, to learn more about customs clearance and freight management services, visit platinumfreight.co.nz.